Okay, so now we're talking about the third unifying experience that was, in a general sense, had among all of the colonials in colonial America during the 18th century, despite this differentiation in terms of region. Now, speaking of difference, this is kind of similar to, in fact, our discussion of religion that we just left behind. If you recall, we were discussing how different areas had different religions, but at the same time, this coexisted with a general acceptance of or toleration of other religions in colonial America, not to mention eventually the emergence of separation of church and state. So, what we see is something similar in terms of social stratification. In the colonies, each region had their own particular form of social stratification. Okay, that is to say, there's divergent patterns here. And oftentimes, economics would shape or influence such patterns. As you can imagine, for example, you'll see in Virginia, the Carolinas, the planter elite that we've been talking about ever since Bacon's Rebellion. Or perhaps in Boston, you see the religious elite becoming more dominant. So, in other words, there are divergent patterns, yet at the same time, some generalizations can be made when it comes to social stratification. So, if you look at this slide, this basically delineates a typical form of stratification that may exist in the colonies. You'll always have the elite class, of course. And then below them will be the middling class. Now, notice this. When we discussed feudal society, we always noted that the monarchy was on top. And of course, that was followed by, let's say, the clergy and the aristocracy or the nobility. And then we talked about perhaps the merchant class, the knights, and then the peasantry and servants at the bottom and slaves. But here we have typically a middling class. Now it's termed middling because there's no such thing per se as a middle class, especially as we understand it today. Rather, you see this middle ranks, if you will. The middling classes were comprised of artisans, shopkeepers, small merchants, and some successful farmers. So when I use the term successful farmers, they're not exactly the super wealthy, planter elite that we see in Virginia, but they are still successful. Maybe they own two slaves, perhaps five slaves. They're certainly not the poor farmer or, the barely successful farmer, for lack of a better term. Um, that would be describing what's on here called yeoman farmers. These are the small landholders. And in fact, most farmers back then were yeoman farmers. In the South, we tend to think of it being comprised mostly of the elite class. And that's because of our culture. We watch movies like Gone with the Wind or read some novels where the elite dominated the focus, right? But in fact, what's actually true is that there were many more yeoman farmers than planters who were the elite and very wealthy. And this would be the case all the way until the Civil War. Okay, so it's important to note that demographically what's going on. So you have the predominance in terms of numbers of yeoman farmers. These are the small landholders again, and below them, of course, are the servants and slaves. Now, again, there are servants and slaves in the north, but much less in number. So when you see social stratification in a place like, say, Connecticut or Massachusetts, the numbers vary, right? Especially down here. For example, in Massachusetts, you might see more or you do see more shopkeepers there, more merchants, more so than yeoman farmers by the 18th century, that is. Okay, so here are some generalizations that could be made. Now, just as in England, of course, there is the elite class here on top. And while most, at least free colonials benefited from economic growth, let's remember that this backdrop of economic prosperity, which enabled participation in, if you recall, consumer culture, consumer habits that developed, right? But despite this backdrop of, broad economic growth, over time in the colonies, you see an elite emerge that, they're not as powerful as their counterparts in England, for example, but they do increasingly dominate domains such as politics and just society in general. Okay, and that's the elite class. Now, again, there's no pure feudal stratification of the colonies, of course. So, how does that reality affect social ranking? Okay, if there's no titled aristocracy, no family pedigrees that, stretch back right through generations, whereby the titles are actually inherited, titles like Lord or Duke. Okay, so how does that affect the colonies? Well, without that feudal tradition, in the absence of that, what you see developing is something called natural development. Okay. Actually, natural development is a attitude and practice. Okay. And natural development basically refers to the more sort of open approach that we see when it comes to gaining entry into this, if you will, inner sanctum of the elite class. It's more open, it's more accessible, though I don't want to exaggerate. For example, today, in principle, you could have a person born in the lowest brackets of our socioeconomic stratification and still become, part of the 1%. It doesn't happen a lot, but it happens. So too back then it happens, but even back then the window is actually not as wide as it is today, but still, and especially when we compare it to Europe, which is still again immersed in that feudal social customs that we've been discussing all semester. Um, it allows persons who possess certain qualities, and again, this is what I'm describing here is natural development. Natural development refers to those certain qualities again, those certain traits and characteristics that enable someone even from the lower classes to gain entry into the elite class. So, what might be some of these characteristics? Well, certainly there's wealth. Okay, certainly there's land ownership. You can't say at this time that the non-property person can gain entry, but still, you see certain qualities like, let's say, natural leadership, education, even respect. That is to say, a person who has garnered the respect among others in that society, right, due to their perhaps charisma or what have you, that allows them access into the elite class, despite the fact that they come from more humble origins. Okay, so again, though the elite who had natural development or who gained access through natural development did not come from the upper classes, it remained possible for them, even though they were quote ordinary, to enter the elite. Now, so this elite called the gentry, right, as indicated in the slide, By the time of the revolution, in fact, you're going to see quite a number of people who become important statesmen, political um, elite that come from more humble origins. I think the best example of this back then was Benjamin Franklin, right? He was sort of celebrated as this person who, by virtue of these natural qualities, like I said, right? Intelligence, education, leadership, respect, and then prosperity, of course, meaning that he's able to gain ascendancy, economically speaking. Someone like Benjamin Franklin would become our founding or part of the founding fathers. And again, all we have to do is compare it to England, where that really can happen in theory, in principle, according to the dictates of feudal practice. Okay, and by the way, later on, when the United States is formed, as you can imagine, and something I just alluded to earlier, this possibility, that is to say, entry into the elite class becomes more and more accessible. In fact, we celebrate cases like this in our history that you don't see, for example, in England, let's say, or France. This idea of a person from the bottommost um, rungs of society, the bottommost rungs of that social ladder, rising to the very top, right? We celebrate that. But in England or a place in Europe where that feudal tradition is much more embedded in their culture, they tend not to celebrate it as much. But we do, because it's part of our American exceptionalism, if you will, this idea of the American dream and success and hard work. And again, we've been discussing this since, if you recall, the Puritans, even, right, with hard work. Okay, so think about Abraham Lincoln, for example, who grew up in a log cabin and then managed to gain his education, that's to say, a law degree, and then eventually becoming arguably our most important president in our history. Okay, so just to repeat this, okay, and let's go back to our argument that we were making since the last video. The argument is this: how can we note certain unifying experience in the face of differentiation? Well, as we just discussed, what we see here is a particular form of social stratification that does not include feudalism. Now, someone may ask, does that mean that their titles completely cancel out if they happen to decide to, that is to say, aristocratic classes coming from England? Does that title cancel out as soon as they set foot in English America? No, that's not the case, but you don't see again that sort of family pedigree um, pretty much guaranteeing the future generations a place in the elite class. Okay, that's the stark difference here. Now, let's think about the embedded argument, right? The embedded argument, that's to say, how does the particular characteristics of the shared experience actually promote democratization? Well, hopefully it's readily apparent to you. I just discussed how natural development was this viewpoint whereby people who were not born into this elite class could actually gain entry so long as they possess certain qualities, like I said. Well, this obviously bespeaks this whole idea of democracy and equality, right? That is to say, people from the lower ranks able to gain entry. This is something that we believe in America today. Even in our colonial history, you see this happening by the 18th century. Now, again, depending on region, but it still is possible in principle, and it did happen in actual practice. So that's what's important to emphasize. So, again, that is what lends support to that argument that we first stated that, you know, the unifying experience in colonial America actually shapes our tradition of democracy. We obviously have a different colonial history than other colonies across the board, let's say in Jamaica or parts of Spanish America. Interestingly enough, in American history, our colonial history is much different in that regard.